There are a number of identification methods commonly used. With objective-based risk identification, the objectives of the organization are used as a starting point. Any event that may endanger achieving an objective, partly or completely, is identified as a risk. In scenario-based risk identification, different scenarios are created representing alternative ways to achieve an objective. Any event that triggers an undesired scenario alternative is identified as a risk. With taxonomy-based risk identification, risk sources are decomposed into classifications. Based on the taxonomy and the knowledge of best practices, a questionnaire is compiled and distributed, and the answers to the questions reveal the risks. Common risk lists can be compiled or obtained building upon the experiences of others in the field. Each risk in the list can be checked for application to a particular situation. Lastly, with risk charting, the above methods are combined. Threats to those resources modifying factors that may increase or decrease the risk and consequences are to be avoided. A matrix under the headings of the modifying factors enables a variety of approaches to be used. One can begin with resources and consider the threats they are exposed to and the consequences of each. Alternatively, one can start with the threats and examine which resources they would affect. Or one can begin with the consequences and determine which combinations of threats and resources would be involved to bring them about. Risk analysis combines the impact of loss rating and the vulnerability rating to evaluate a potential risk to the facility from a given threat. This result is a table or grid that combines the two risk determinants to produce a single measure for use in prioritization. A typical measure is a composite risk index. The impact of the risk event is assessed using a scale such as 0 to 5 or extremely high to low, where 0 or low represents the minimum and 5 or high denotes the maximum possible impact of an occurrence, usually in terms of financial losses. The probability of occurrence is likewise assessed on a scale of 0 to 5 or extremely high to low, where 0 or low represents the zero probability of the event actually occurring, while 5 or extremely high represents 100% probability of occurrence, i.e. certainty. During risk evaluation, controls that could mitigate or eliminate the identified risk as to the organization's operations are identified. The goal of the recommended controls is to reduce the level of risk appropriate to the IT systems and its data to an acceptable level. Factors should be considered in recommending controls on alternative solutions to minimize or eliminate identified risks. These include the effectiveness of the recommended options, such as the system's compatibility, legislation and regulation, organizational policy, operational impact, and lastly, safety and reliability. Not all possible recommended controls can be implemented to reduce loss. To determine which ones are required and appropriate for a specific organization, a cost-benefit analysis should be conducted for the proposed recommended controls to demonstrate that the cost of implementing the controls can be justified by the reduction in the level of risk. In addition, the operational impact, such as the effect on system performance, and feasibility, such as the technical requirements or user acceptance of introducing the recommended options, should be evaluated carefully. Risk treatment involves the prioritizing, evaluating, and implementing of the appropriate risk-reducing controls recommended from the risk assessment process. Because the elimination of all risks is usually impractical or close to impossible, it is the responsibility of senior management and functional and business managers to use the most appropriate controls to decrease mission risk to an acceptable level, with minimal adverse impacts on the organization's resources and mission. Common risk treatments include the following 4 tactics. Risk avoidance includes not performing an activity that could carry risk. Avoidance may seem the answer to all risk, but avoiding risk also means losing out on the potential gain that accepting the risk may have allowed. Acknowledging that risk can be positive or negative, optimizing risk means finding a balance between negative risk and the benefits of the operation or activity, and between risk reduction and the effort applied. Risk sharing is sharing with another party the burden of loss or the benefit of gain from the risk, and the measures to reduce the risk. Some ways of managing risk fall into multiple categories. Risk retention pools are technically retaining the risk for the group, but spreading it over a whole group. Risk retention involves accepting the loss or benefit of the gain from the risk when it occurs. True self-insurance falls in this category. Risk retention is a viable strategy for small risks where the cost of insuring against the risk would be greater over time than the total losses sustained. This slide illustrates the common thought process involved in treating a risk. The threat source is identified and the organization assessed as vulnerable. In this example, an attacker's costs are deemed relevant in assessing the risk since it is assumed that the attackers require a payoff incentive before initiating the threat. If the attacker's costs are less than their gains, then the financial costs of mitigation for the organization are appraised. Only if the loss to the organization is greater than the cost of initiating action is the risk considered unacceptable. Organizations can analyze the extent of the risk reduction generated by the new or enhanced controls in terms of the reduced threat likelihood or impact, the two parameters that define the mitigated level of risk to the organization's mission. Implementation of new or enhanced controls can mitigate risk by one of three primary methods: eliminating some of the system's vulnerabilities, flaws, and weaknesses, thereby reducing the number of possible threat source vulnerability pairs; adding a targeted control to reduce the capacity and motivation of a threat source; or reducing the magnitude of the adverse impacts, for example, limiting the extent of a vulnerability or modifying the nature of the relationship between the IT systems and the organization's mission. The risk remaining after the implementation of new or enhanced controls is the residual risk. Risk mitigation measures often fall into one of four generic risk options. Design a new business process with adequate built-in risk control and containment measures from the start. Periodically reassess risks that are accepted in ongoing processes as a normal feature of business operations and modify mitigation measures. Transfer risk to an external agency such as an insurance company, or avoid risks altogether, perhaps by closing down a particular high-risk business area. Risk recommendations should be considered together in a risk treatment plan that documents the decisions about how each of the identified risks should be handled and considers the interdependencies amongst them and their treatments. Risk mitigation needs to be approved by the appropriate level of management. For instance, a risk concerning the image of the organization should have top management concern behind it, whereas IT management would have the authority to decide on computer virus risks. The risk management plan should propose applicable and effective security controls for managing those risks. For example, an observed high risk of computer virus should be mitigated by acquiring and implementing antivirus software. A good risk management plan should contain a schedule for control implementation and responsible persons for those actions. Initial risk management plans will never be perfect. Practice, experience, and actual loss results will necessitate changes in the plan and contribute information to allow possible different decisions to be made in dealing with the risk being faced. Risk analysis results and management plans should be updated periodically. The reasons for this are to evaluate whether the previously selected security controls are still applicable and effective, and to evaluate the possible risk level changes in the business